Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the first of a double bill that are coming up kind of one after the other one, just like waiting for buses. They're coming one after another. Anyway, 80 years ago, between the 8th and 9th of March, a German raid on the Normandy port of Granville took place. My guest today has a personal connection to this story via his grandfather. He is making the leap from viewer to guest. So welcome to World War II TV in terms of participating through the medium of people seeing you. David, good morning, sir.
Good morning from cool but sunny Tennessee. How are y'all doing?
We're all good. So we were just chatting before, going live there. This raid in this part of Normandy, it should be better known because it was one of the last kind of counterattacks, if you like, offensive measures by the Germans in World War II. By the spring of '45, they're losing on all fronts, and this is their kind of last gasp, trying to achieve some kind of small victory. Although it's not going to turn the tide in terms of the strategy. But we're going to leap straight in. David's got a whole raft of display materials, so there we are. I'm going to hand over to David to take us through this, and we always love it when we've got a personal connection. So and we're on the 80th anniversary as well, so it's really cool. So over to you, sir.
Great. As Paul said, that 80 years ago yesterday, uh, early in the morning, just after midnight, this ship you're seeing up in the upper left corner there, that's a more modern view after some reconfiguration. It's a post-war view, but and there's my grandfather, a picture from him before he shipped out to Europe, and then there's the port. And this happened, and it was a very brief battle and a very little known battle. It's kind of a niche subject, but important in that it affected my family's history,
Yeah.
particularly my mother and her siblings and my grandmother. So that's why I'm telling the story. And as I got studying more and more about it, I became kind of obsessed in a way with the story of PC 564. So the book that I'm putting together, and I've started to write through the first chapter and the introduction, and I'm hoping to get it published maybe next year. We'll see, and tell the story of the ship as well, the history of the ship, her crew, what it was like to be aboard a ship like that. And then the last chapter will be the Granville raid. So let's go forward here. I'm going to begin with a poem, a short poem. I won't bore you too much, but poetry is a real big part of naval life. A lot of sailors are sadly given to poetry and jargon, I think. So this is called Sea Fever. Some of you probably have heard this. It's well known. I must go down to the seas again, to the lonely sea and sky, and all I ask is a tall ship and a star to steer her by, and the wheels kick, and the wind song, and the white sails shaking, and the gray mist on the sea's face, and a gray dawn breaking. That's John Masefield, Sea Fever from 1902. All right, let's move forward. Okay, I did a dedication page here, of course, to the memory of my grandfather, Lucien Joseph Lacroix. That's my poor French pronunciation. Memory of the fallen in the Granville raid, and all the fallen. To the former sailors of patrol craft and small ship sailors of the Donald Duck Navy. That's what the small ship sailors were known by. To William J. Viegel, who up until recently I thought had passed away, but I spoke to him a few days ago, author of Patrol Craft of World War II and Sea Bag of Memories. Now he's about to turn 100 years old. That's amazing. And he's still sharp as a tack. To my cousin Paul Shenever, who did the initial original research into Lucien Lacroix, and to our good friend Lorelei Combe, our regimental sergeant major, and her Papa Russ. He's her adopted World War II daddy. And I came across some information about the ship that he served on, SC 686, which was even smaller than PC 564. And to the memory of all those who served in World War II and their families. So here's for Lorelei. This is her grandfather, or her Papa Russ's vessel, after it had been thrown ashore on 19 October 1945 in a typhoon. And that's a picture of the islands around Okinawa. And that upper right corner of that left-hand photo, that's where Tsukushima, that's where his ship went ashore. And that was a terrible ordeal. Over 300 vessels were damaged, some sunk, many thrown ashore. So that's where it happened. So just wanted to shout out to Lorelei and let her know we're thinking of her. All right. There's Paul. That's my cousin. He's about 10 years younger than I'm 65. So he's about 55. And he spent some time in the Marine Corps for about 8 years. He's a really dedicated family man and a true patriot, combat veteran in Iraq. And he was a police officer in Agawam, Massachusetts. That's about 25, 30 minutes drive from where I grew up. Um, and his research was done the old-fashioned way. He didn't have access to much of the digital archives that I have. In the lower left, you see an aerial picture of PC 564, and that was her nickname, the Bronx Express, because she was built in New York, in Brooklyn, New York. Up in the upper right, that's the emblem of the Donald Duck Navy, and the designer of that is in the picture below, Signalman James Dickey. He was a member of PC 564 and a crewmate of my grandfather's. Okay, this is the first time I found out about what Paul was doing. My mother sent me a copy of this article from a Springfield newspaper. Okay, and they had this article in there, and it's basically showing Paul. He had put together all this research, and he was allowed to do a presentation in the Springfield Museum for about a month and a half. And then I was really glad to find that out, because finally the family knew what happened. Whenever we would ask my mother about it, and I noticed that her maiden name on her wedding certificate was different than her mother's last name, which was Kessler. So being a young man at the time, I didn't understand. So I said, "Mom, why is your maiden name different than Meme's?" And she said, "Well, that's because she remarried." And I said, "Why? Did she get a divorce?" She said, "No, I lost my father in World War II." And I asked her what happened. She said, "Well, I don't really know. All I know is he died off the coast of Normandy." So you can imagine a young man with a burgeoning interest in World War II thinking, "Oh, he was in the Normandy invasion." So I thought maybe he was killed on one of those ubiquitous landing craft, or a destroyer off the coast, or some such conveyance. I just didn't know. And so it kind of stored it in my memory for years and years and years. And eventually we were gratified to find that Paul did this research. These are some of the source documents. I won't spend a lot of time here, just so people can see where we're getting our information from. Um, some of these have a plastic sheen on. That's because I took pictures of Paul's research. And some of these I have digital copies of now. But we had archives from the National Archives, copies of his military records, personal letters from family members of the survivors. Um, there's photos from various websites. And then up in the upper right is Stanley Cusick. That's the man who some of his photos you're going to see. So glad that Paul was able to meet with him before he passed away, and he passed those photos on to him. And then in the lower right, war diaries, ship's logs, operation reports from NARA through this great website, the Fold 3 website.
Yeah, brilliant website.
Yeah, it is. I love it. These are some of the main primary literary sources that I used, and articles, and various magazines. Like After the Battle, was able to get a digital copy of that. The Occupation of the Channel Islands on the bottom there in the center. Those are written by a husband and wife team, the Gins family. All right, I think it's William and Margaret Gins. And then over to the right is a term paper that was done by a daughter of one of the survivors, and that was something I was able to make a copy of. Up up top on the left, you got PC Patrol Craft. That's William Viegel's excellent history of patrol craft. And then to the right of there, Sea Bag Full of Memories, which he talks about all the different small ships. Great source of material. The Last Raid by Will Fowler. I had to mention Nick Hewitt's excellent Coastal Convoys. That gave me some insights into the fact that even in 1945, the convoys going to deliver coal to the Channel Islands were part of that system. Um, and then, of course, upper right, there's 2 volumes of the Patrol Craft Sailors Association. They call them history books. A lot of firsthand accounts in there. That was awesome. So these are my online sources. I apologize if they kind of got jumbled up, but main one I want to mention and shout out to is JerseyBunkerstours.com Granville Raid, because that's that's where I first really got a deep dive into the battle. And there's various U-boat.net, Wikipedia, of course, Allied convoy codes. That was important. And then Life magazine had a history of Miami Beach, but that's for another part of the story I'd like to tell later. Okay, here's the start of how my grandfather came here. This is a picture of my arrière-grand-père, my great-grandfather. He was from Quebec, Canada. He immigrated to the United States in 1926, along with my grandfather and my aunt Yvonne, whom we call Auntie Shorty. But he was 14, she was 16, and they resided in Holyoke, Massachusetts, where he worked for the hydroelectric power plant there as a fireman. And I just put that in there. That's the census the 1930 census that we found him in. There's Holyoke, and that's the state that I grew up in. It's not where I was born, but that Springfield is kind of the regional capital of Western Mass. And the star that's Holyoke, that's just over across northwest of the Connecticut River. All right, that runs from all the way from down near New York all the way up into the hills of New England. And there's some facts about it. It's been there a long time. The first settlers came from 1655. In the 1880s, became a manufacturing city. It was known as the paper city because there's many paper mills there. There still are. Still uses hydroelectricity as its main source of power today. A very efficient source of power. There's a photo I found of a postcard, kind of how it looked back then. Surprisingly, a lot of that architecture is still there today. You can still see the old style kind of turn of the century architecture. And there in the background is the Berkshire Mountains, beautiful place, Western New England. All right, and that's where my mother's grew up as well. There's a picture of their family around circa 1932, I believe. And there's my great grandfather in the background with his 3 daughters from a first marriage. They all became nuns for some reason. The Lacroix family was very Catholic. All right, and then in the foreground, that's the handsome young fellow holding the child. That's Romeo. That's my half brother of my grandfather's. And then there's his family, and then that strapping young man there in the right foreground. That's Lucien Lacroix. And then to his left would be Auntie Shorty or Yvonne. So there's another census where we found in 1940, we found information about where he resided and his family. All right, there's a little brief biographical chart of my grandfather. So you see where he was born in 1918. Moved to Holyoke in 1926. Married my grandmother Rose Yvonne Marie Quinville in 1937. They had 3 children: Janet, my mother; Raymond, my uncle; and Carol, my aunt. He worked at a furniture store in Holyoke for $15 a week. Imagine that. So $60 a month was what he was trying to raise a family on. Joined the U.S. Navy Reserve late in the war in 22 April 1944. He transferred to England in 5th of May. Reported aboard PC 564 15 September, and then was killed in action 9th of March 1945. If I'm moving too fast, let me know. If I'm not going fast.
No, we're good. William just asked, is that the city of Quebec or the state? Yeah.
Well, he was Saint Alexis was the name of the province in Quebec.
Right.
So
Okay.
he was, yeah, he wasn't from the city. Good question.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, these were that that document on the left was one of the first documents Paul came across. He asked for a record of his military service, and this is the form they sent him. And it's very bare bones. It just says when he joined the Navy and when he was killed. So that was like the first document. The one on the right, I actually have that in my possession. My mother graciously allowed me to have it. That's the actual telegram where my grandmother found out that he was killed. Um, so that's a precious document to me. These are interesting. These are his everyone in the United States, every male above a certain age had to register for the draft in 1940. So this was my grandfather's draft registration cards. Now he wasn't drafted, but he was about to be drafted, and that was a big motivator for him joining the service of his choice. You can see he wasn't a very tall man up on the left, 5'4". He was kind of a stocky Frenchman, although he was probably skinny then, only 150 pounds. To the right, you can see where they lived and his wife's name, where they lived in Holyoke, and where I think it says, look at his handwriting on the bottom where he signed it. That's some beautiful penmanship.
Yeah.
My
Yeah.
mother still writes that way. If anyone writes me a letter that I can read her cursive, it's my mother. So she still writes that way. These we'll spend just a short time on. These are the records. Like I said, I apologize for the plastic sheen, but from left to right, there's his primary induction on the 22nd of April of let me see, February, and then of course in the center, the ubiquitous fingerprints. And if you notice in the center in the upper left, it says Great Britain. He was a citizen of Great Britain, and I wondered about that, and then I realized Canada at that time was still a dominion of Great
Yeah.
Britain.
Yeah.
So he had never got his citizenship, which kind of surprised me. So he was still a Canadian citizen. And then to the right, you can see where, yeah, that's where he was transferred to from the Naval Receiving Station in Springfield. And that's where he was transferred to Sampson Naval Training Center, which we're going to visit next. So this is something online I found, Sampson U.S. Naval Training Center in upstate New York on a beautiful Lake Seneca, which is about 50 miles south of Lake Ontario. Okay, kind of halfway between, I think, Syracuse and Rochester. And there's just some pictures we're not going to spend a lot of time on, just to give you people an idea of what basic training was like. And you can see down below that this base, established in 42, trained over 410,000 recruits during the war. All right. It was rapidly built. At first, there was only 4 main basic training places in the United States for the Navy. So they had to add additional ones pretty quickly. There's some more pictures. Now, firefighting and damage control and swimming. Those are 3 of the main things all sailors learn. My father became a fireman after he got out of the Navy because of what he learned in basic training. It really impressed him. So if you want to come back and look at these later, that's why I wanted to show them so people could, if you want to come back and see it on a replay, you can watch them. There's some more showing different classes and company drill, battalion drill. Interesting on the bottom right, father and son were at the same basic training company, and dad was put in charge of his son who's on a work detail. How ironic. So this is the graduation photo I was able to find for my grandfather's class. There's his company 272 on the bottom right, and that arrow, that's my grandfather, and I verified that with my mother. She said, yes, that's your grandfather. So
Brilliant stuff.
yes, I was so lucky to find that website, rpadan.com. And after graduating, he was given a leave. I think it was a pass to go where he wanted to go before he had to report no later than 11 April to the New York Naval Yard. All right, there's a photo taken while he was on that leave or pass, and to the left, that's him in his uniform, and you can see he's built up some muscle there from his basic training. And I put these names in French, so bear with me. That's Grand-père. To his left is Oncle, that's my Uncle Raymond. Then Tante Carol, Mère, my mother, Janet, Grand-mère, Rose Yvonne. But my grandfather put up with some prejudice when he moved to Massachusetts. Of course, here was a French Canadian, spoke English with a broken accent, and his father wanted him to go to a Catholic school. The only Catholic school in Holyoke was predominantly Irish Catholic. So you can imagine a 14-year-old boy arriving, being thrust into that environment, and the way that children rather rib one another. He got in a lot of fights. So thought that was interesting. From that experience, my grandmother was trying to teach her children French because her mother kind of insisted on it. But my grandfather said, no, we're in the United States, we're going to speak English. And I think part of that was he didn't want his children to have to experience that prejudice. All right. These are his records showing his arrival from Sampson, New York, to the receiving station in New York. And then the one to the right, the second one from the left, unfortunately, he was late, so they gave him a court martial. I mean, this is wartime. They're pretty serious. But because he threw himself on the mercy of the court and admitted it freely, and he begged forgiveness, they decided that he was going to get a bad conduct discharge, but they remitted it for 6 months on the condition that if he screwed up at all, you're out. So, but they did take half a month's pay for 4 months. So you can imagine that made my grandmother just absolutely thrilled. All right. And then to the right shows him going, let me see. This is where he was sent from New York. I think he went across on either the Queen Mary or Queen Elizabeth. I'm still looking into that. And he went to Londonderry, and thank you, James Walsh, for correcting me. I thought it was England, but it's Ireland. And then from there, he was sent south to Falmouth, I believe it was.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he joined there an advanced amphibious base, they called it. So LST gun crews is the training he did. I'm sure he did a lot of work details, being he had been in trouble. But so he didn't get aboard the ship for a long time until September. So he did a lot of training, probably on gunnery drills and whatever else. So these are great primary source documents. I found all the muster rolls from PC 564 from the time she was commissioned until beyond the end of the war. And I'm putting together a list of the crew members that served aboard her to be used in the book in an appendix for people who want to see where their family members might have been. But this is the one that was where in September of 1944. And let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 from the bottom on the left form. That's my grandfather's entry. Okay. And it shows his date of 15 September 44. Now, many of the men on this list had been original plank owners. So think about that. Some of these fellows had been aboard that ship since 12 July 1942. And then every muster roll, these were quarterly, there was a number of reports of changes. That's how the Navy kept track of who's coming and going, when they left, when they came aboard, the reasons, etc. And then you can see my grandfather was received in Dartmouth. All right. Okay, we're going to talk briefly about the specifications. This is for the nerds among us. But you can see that picture there in the upper right. That's PC 564 in her early war, what do they call it? Her early war setup. Okay. Instead of having the 40 millimeter gun aft, a lot of the early war PCs were built with 2 3-inch guns. And instead of having 20 millimeter guns for anti-air, a lot of them had 50 caliber machine guns. Sometime around 1943, they were converted, and they had this below the specifications that you're reading. So you can see that she wasn't very long, 173 feet, maybe 174 if you're generous, and only 23 feet wide. Now you put her next to a destroyer, it's about half the size. Okay, so it's a little smaller than a destroyer escort. I wouldn't say like in the 19th century, she wouldn't be considered a sloop of war, probably a brig of war. Okay, that's my way of thinking. I love the history of sail. So um, she had a very shallow draft, so she could go inshore, which is one of the main reasons they used her as they did during the invasions. That many invasions they took part in. It says she had a speed of 20 knots, but really 18 is more like it. Um, they could get up to over 20 knots in an emergency, but it put a big strain on the engines. You see her crew is small. They were submarines in World War II that had bigger crews than that. And there's her armament. Okay, I want to, we're not going to dwell much on it, but I do want to mention the two M20 Mousetrap. I call them rocket launchers. They're really more spigot mortars, kind of like you see in the Hedgehog. Okay, but they only fired 8 forward firing mortar bombs. So that was kind of the early American version of the Hedgehog. And those 1440 brake horsepower Fairbanks Morse diesel engines, they were in high demand from submarines because they used them as well. So there was a shortage of those early in the war. This one here is her chronology. Now this is the official chronology from NavSource. And also if you look her up in Samuel Eliot Morrison's official history, basically it shows when she was laid down, launched, commissioned. But the main thing it says is that she was engaged on 8 March 45 by the German minesweepers, and it lists the 4 of them and 9 smaller craft. Well, that's kind of a misnomer. Really, she didn't fight all those ships. Okay, she did fight 3, which we'll find out were kind of like gun barges, and but they kind of made it look like she fought the entire Kriegsmarine flotilla, but that's not true. It says 15 men had prematurely abandoned ship. We're going to read about that, of which 14 were captured. And the one that wasn't was my grandfather. French fishing boats arrived to help the wounded, and the next day PC 564 was towed to St. Malo. That's true. And you can look at, even after the war, how long she served. She was actually given to the South Korean Navy in 1964. They changed her name to Seoraksan, and then finally decommissioned in 1974. So these hulls lasted a long time. This is her actual chronology. We're not going to spend a lot of time on there, but you can see these are the numbers of types of missions that she did during the war. All right. And I think it's indicative of the class that they were used for so many different roles. And that's another reason I want to write the book, so I can tell that broader story. And I hope someday I can come back and do another presentation on that part.
Yeah. Ian T asked, is a US Navy patrol craft roughly similar to a Royal Navy corvette?
I would say yes, about the same. They had the same rough speed. The Corvettes were a little larger, and of course they were broader. They were based on a whaling ship, I believe, and they rolled a lot. Their seakeeping was not much better than a PC. PCs were very rough rides because they were so narrow. As a matter of fact, I'm going to read, if you'll bear with me, a short poem again. And this is from Melvin DeWitt, and I got it from this excellent book, Sea Bag Full of Memories by William Viegel. And I'm going to share it with you, and it's really short. Can you sit serene on a bronco mean, or stay on a plunging steer? Can you calmly flop in a boiler shop and peacefully pound your ear? Can you keep your feet on freezing sleet in a wind that'll chill you through? Then maybe, mate, you've the stuff to rate a berth with a PC crew. Swoop like a gull, dive like a plover, turn on a dime with a nickel over, racing whippet and jumping goat, leaping Lena, the PC boat. Isn't that precious? I
That's
like
very
it.
good. Yep. Yep.
So moving forward. Okay, now we're going to skip how she got overseas, and there's a whole story about that and how she spent time off the coast of Normandy, okay, and supporting Operation Neptune. That's a very detailed story which we won't have time to get into today. But now she's finished up her service off the coast of Normandy, and now they've driven the Germans back out of France, and they've captured a lot of these French ports on the southern part of Normandy, starting with Cherbourg and moving down the coast. Okay, so on the left there's my that's when after my grandfather arrived, and he had visited Cherbourg, of course, aboard the ship, and he probably on a leave or liberty, and there he is clowning around with a French civilian in one of the in one of the bunkers. Okay, and that was sometime after 15 September, and he joined in Dartmouth. All right, when they went back to Dartmouth to get the mail, and they picked him up. All right, in October. Okay, oh that map. Let's talk about this. I The main port she operated out of was Cherbourg. Her task group, CTG 125.2, I believe, and then also Granville. You see there, Saint Malo, and sometimes they would patrol around and about the Channel Islands. But those were the main three ports that she operated out of. And on the right, you can see the actual war diaries from October, where on the 3rd of October, PC 564, among other ships, was fired on from Albany by the gun batteries there. No one was hit, but they were still dangerous waters to be patrolling around, because those German guns could reach out and touch from Albany all the way about 5 miles inland at Cap de la Hague. So, pardon my poor French. So anyway, I won't read that. I just like to show it in there. I'm showing off my research. Bear with me.
Yeah, no, brilliant.
Okay. Then basically the ships of her task group, they would rotate the duties of who was going to be a guard vessel outside various ports. And so that's how she ended up in Granville on the 9th of March, which we'll find out as we move forward. I've got these pictures in there for a little background information. This is kind of what it looked like in the fall and winter of 44. Stanley Cusick took these wonderful pictures. There's low tide at Cherbourg on the upper left. The middle, that's actually, it was Saint Malo, the way it looked. You can still see it's badly damaged from bombardments. Low tide at Granville, that's kind of the mole, the outer mole, what it looked like back then. And the tides were there was only 2 times a day a ship could get in and out of Granville. It's probably still the same today to the
Yeah,
inner
I think
harbor.
so. Yeah.
Because the tides can get really low, even so low that sometimes ships are grounded. Then in the lower left, that's an interesting picture. I know it's difficult to see the figures on the far left. When I first saw that, it looked like, is that 2 men dancing? And I said, no, men don't usually dance with each other with their shirts off. And I saw one man has his arm raised, and I said, that's a haymaker about to be delivered. So there are some sailors having a fight and some spectators at Cherbourg. Probably someone said, hey, you Donald Duck maybe person, and someone said, yeah, well, kiss my arse.
Mm.
Okay, there's the entrance to Saint Malo, the way it looked in 1944. And I don't know where this Napoleonic era fortress is, but I'm glad that.
Yeah, there's about 3 or 4 around San Malo. As soon as I saw the photo there, I wondered which one of it there is there. But when you walk around, as I did not that long ago, a few weeks ago at San Malo, you can see there's, I'm saying at least 4 of those Napoleonic Vauban era forts around there. So I don't know which one it is, but and there's more up and down the Brittany coast. And I was just also going to say that the fact that they're still patrolling those waters, into the kind of latter part of 1944, even though that Normandy is well and truly liberated, but as you go around the coast and go further south towards, La Rochelle and Saint-Nazaire, those places ended up still being in German hands till May 45. So that, a year's difference in liberation, 11 months between the top of Normandy and the lower part of the western coast of France. So yeah, interesting stuff.
I found out as well, and that's good. I'm glad you mentioned that, Paul. It's great mention. There was a danger always of mines. The Germans were
Yeah,
constantly trying to remine areas. So there was mine clearing and remining, resowing of mines. Uh, the U-boats, even though they weren't in the Atlantic operating as much, they were still a danger, even all the way to the end of the war.
yeah,
And also the E-boats, until they were driven out of various places, the small S-boats they called them, they were a danger too. So they could make lightning raids out into the channel. So yeah, very good point, Paul.
thanks.
I wanted to mention this briefly. I'd like to do a deeper dive into this. This is the Leopoldville disaster. That's the Belgian transport ship, or a luxury liner that was converted to a transport ship. And I apologize for the overlap on the slides, but essentially what happened on the 24th of December, she was torpedoed about 5 miles off Cherbourg. Everyone was celebrating Christmas Eve ashore. You know, they didn't have any reason to worry. They're trying to deliver men from the 66th Infantry Regiment to be sent as reinforcements to the Bulge. All right, she was sunk, and then took her about 2 hours to sink. What happened was the crew abandoned ship. They had never done any any kind of drills on abandoning ship. So all these soldiers were confused. They were frightened. And it took about an hour for some of the rescue vessels to get out to her. Now, HMS Brilliant, which was the senior commander of the escort, HMS Brilliant, he and his ship rescued 500 of those soldiers. That's a lot of people on a destroyer. Okay, the other three went after the submarine. I don't know if they ever sank her, but PC 564 and 461 were just two of the 30 some odd small vessels that arrived, and they were able to rescue. If you look in the upper left, that's the excerpt from the war diaries. They were able to rescue 1,433 of the soldiers and sailors, but 800 or more succumbed and either from hypothermia or drowned. Now, the lower left, those two color photos, years later, this was a Royal Navy able seaman who was serving as a gunner aboard Leopoldville. All right. And he'd always wanted to get in touch with the man who rescued him, because he was about to go under when Wesley Johnson, one of the lieutenants, jumped in the water and saved him. And through a journalist, he was able to get the address and sent a very touching letter, which I have, and I'll put that in a future presentation. It'll definitely be in the book. But he thanked him for saving him, and he wished he could come over and visit, but it was beyond him. So very touching personal story, and thought it kind of was one of those things that helps meld a crew together too.
Yeah.
So I thought I'd.
Mag met a survivor of the Leopoldville
Oh,
last year. A veteran was over with the Best Defense Foundation, was part of the group that took him to the Wall of the Missing at the cemetery in Omaha, and all those names of the mostly the tank battalion that were lost, or sorry, the division on the tank battalion, and it was very moving for her
I'm
to be
sure.
part, because her Mag's sister is from Cherbourg, so Mag has a big connection to Cherbourg. So it was a nice day for Mag.
By the way, wish her belated happy birthday for me.
Will do. She's in the other
Okay.
room. Yeah.
Okay. Many happy returns, Mag. Okay. This was a critical period right before Granville. All right. They had, as you can see, major personnel changes. I'm not going to read through all those. And there's the reports where I was actually able to corroborate that. But to the left, in the beginning of the year in January, my grandfather got in trouble again. He seemed to always be overstaying his leave or something. But he got a liberty when they were visiting Dartmouth, and he was late coming back. So they gave him what's called a captain's mass. It's kind of like a administrative punishment. So the CO, Lieutenant Spencer at the time, gave him a 5 days restriction. So yeah, Pepe, when he got out partying, I guess he just didn't want to come back to the ship. So you can see, I'm going to sum this up on the major personnel changes. They had 16 new enlisted ratings report aboard. some from one from PC 1176. Most of them were brand new from the States. All right. No experience at all aboard ship. 18 enlisted ratings that were experienced were transferred off, probably some to go home, some to other assignments. All right. Several of the officers were brand new, and they lost the very experienced commander, Lieutenant Spencer, and Wesley Johnson, who was a senior lieutenant aboard. And they picked up Percy Sandell, who was fresh from the States, all right, and never commanded a ship. And of course, Ensign Francis Duval. Now, he'll play an important role, which we'll see later. But you can see that's about 30% of the crew was either new or 20% were brand new. So now we're going to get into where we're going to talk about today, Granville Raid. All right, now Granville, I've been, I read this great book. It's written in 1975, The German Occupation of the Channel Islands by C.J. I don't know if you can see that.
Yep. Yeah.
C.G. Cruikshank. It's
Yeah.
a bit
Good book.
dated, yeah, but it's where I really was able to find out a lot of the history of the Channel Islands and the occupation. Well, the Channel Islands were basically a part of the Duchy of Normandy from 933 AD under William the Conqueror, which was at the time Duke William. Of course, he came and became the conqueror in 1066, but those islands were still part of the Duchy of Normandy. And eventually, we know that the English kings occupied a great part of mainland France, Normandy being one of those areas, and Calais and various other places. Finally, after I think the 100 Years' War period, the English were driven off mainland, except for Calais and I think Tournai, which they finally, I think, was the reign of Mary Tudor toward her end of her reign, where finally all the English were expelled from the mainland, but the islands were still part of the crown, and they are to this day. They're considered states. They're run by bailiffs, I believe, and an attorney general and a solicitor general, and they are the ones who interact. They can speak in the assemblies, and they can vote. So that's very interesting, and I hope I can visit the Channel Islands when I come. And I want to once again shout out to Phil Merritt and his graciously allowing me to use this information. Now that map on the left shows the circles are the areas where the guns could reach out to on the various islands, heavily fortified, occupied in 1940, but starting 1941, the fortifications were being built. And the commander that took over there was a General Major von Schmettau. Now, the von Schmettau name is an ancient Prussian name, goes back a long ways in Prussian history. Matter of fact, there was a von Schmettau who fought against Napoleon at the Battle of Ligny, right before Waterloo. And anyway, this general, he was in charge of the 319th Infantry Division and the Channel Islands overall. He was the chief commandant. So he was really responsible for overseeing the buildup of the incredible amount of fortifications on those islands. They were more fortified, as we found out from Phil, than much of the coast of Normandy before the invasion. So that was part of the reason why the Allies never tried to invade the Channel Islands. They thought the casualties would be just ridiculous, and they didn't really want to cause that much damage to the civilian towns and the civilians. So, but anyway, there's some facts about it. Heavily fortified by Organization Todt, and I encourage people to watch that great presentation Paul had Phil on for. He talks about those in detail. They were both paid and constricted laborers. All right, mainly slave labor from Ukraine. What's that tell you? But also 1,000 French Jews were also used.
Yeah.
most
And just a bit
heavily.
of forewarning, viewers. Myself, Mag, JD from History Underground, and John from World War II Wayfinder are heading to Guernsey and Alderney later this month for a few days to make basically shitloads of content for our channel, as we'll all be making stuff about the Channel Islands. So that's thanks to the Guernsey Tourist Board and their kind invitation via Nick Lahore or anything else. So there'll be lots of Channel Islands content coming on all of those 3 channels into the spring and summer.
That's great. You can guarantee I'll be watching those, Paul.
Cool. Me too.
And I'm going to send that to my brothers. They love watching your shows too. We're all World War II history nerds. It was supposed to serve as a model of occupation. That's kind of a myth. There's no such thing as a kind. It was gentler than the occupations in mainland Europe for sure, but it doesn't mean it was easy. All right. There were a lot of shortages of food, a lot of shortages of medical supplies, a lot of restrictions on who could come and go and when. And people were transported off to Germany to work as laborers. It was not a fun experience. By 1945, they had serious shortages of food. It really got to be difficult. But above all, coal for heating, as well as many of the German ships needed coal to operate their boilers. The Red Cross, and there's on the bottom right, that's a picture from Jersey Bunker Tours of the SS Vega. That was the Red Cross ship that made periodic deliveries of supplies. And to the credit of the Germans and General von Schmettau, the Germans never interfered with those supplies. They didn't pilfer them. They made sure they got to the civilians, even though they were suffering too from a shortage of food. So good for you, General von Schmettau. Now, this is the beginning of the Granville raid, how it starts. This is prior to it in December, and I'm going to kind of summarize this. There's a picture of the ubiquitous Higgins boat in the bottom right there. There was a Fähnrich. What do they call it? Fähnrich is sort of like an ensign in the German Navy. He and I think it was 4 German Fallschirmjäger managed to escape in one of those at night and managed to get through the harbor defenses and made it all the way to the Minquiers, and then they were eventually brought to Saint-Hélier, and then they reported what was going on in Granville. All right. And they did try to chase them down. There's the 2 ships above there, armed trawler. That's not the actual HMS Prospect, but a picture of what she looked like. And above her, PC 1233. So now I can only imagine it was the lateness at which they finally realized, hey, we're missing a landing craft, but they never did catch up to them. So they were able to report to the high command there on the Channel Islands what they were seeing, the number of ships that were coming and going, how many POWs were involved in loading the coal and unloading the coal, and the harbor defenses. They knew a lot because, they're not dummies. I love this is an actual map from 1944 of Granville showing the elevations and the key buildings. Now around that picture, you see the destroyed bunkers and positions and observation towers. I think the Germans did that before they left, because everywhere that they left a port, they would destroy the port. Matter of fact, it took a couple of months for Granville to be put back in operation after the Third Army came through and liberated it. I put there Nick's comment when he was on. It was all about coal, and it was particularly cold. There was a cold winter, as we know from the Battle of the Bulge history, probably the coldest in Europe for a century. To assist in the freezing French civilians, the British ships began bringing coal in, mainly from Wales, I think. And Granville was one of the ports that handled these deliveries from colliers sailing up South Wales. This was well observed by the German escapees, as well as the fact that there was only a light force of Allied soldiers, lightly armed, and few harbor defenses. The German bunkers and weapons had all been decommissioned. That's a quote from Jersey Bunkers Tours. All right. The first attempt in February. Okay. The intelligence that was gathered from the POWs. There's a picture of Graf von Schmettow, commander of the British Channel Islands. He decided to hit back and it raised the morale of his men because they were bored, like all young soldiers. They want to do something. They'd been kept out of the war and they thought, hey, we want a chance. So he planned to put Granville out of action, capture a coal ship, and try to destroy the rest of the shipping. They also wanted to try to capture some Allied officers for interrogation. In January of 1945, they started putting together their raiding force. They selected about 150 German Wehrmacht soldiers from a couple of the regiments, and they started to train them up. I believe it was in Guernsey. All right. And then also there was about 30 or 40 Kriegsmarines sailors that were trained up to be kind of special ops, raiding force, commandos. All right. They trained up and then were transferred to Jersey and billeted near Goree Harbor, and they had to wait for the right tides and conditions, and then the moonlight and all that. So on the night of 7 February, that's when they decided to do this, but it went wrong. They started off right, but one of the ships had engine problems, and that group and all the ships with her went back to port. The other half went on for a while, and then when they noticed they were by themselves, they returned to port. But only one ship, which was a diversionary vessel, S-112, which was actually a boat, uh, went on with its mission. All right. And they were to basically drop some parachute mines they had captured from the RAF off the coast of Saint Malo, and then to try to make contact with the patrol ship, which was PC-552. All right. There's the War Diary report where I was able to read in detail about this. Essentially, there's PC-552 in the upper right. And then you see that's not S-112, but what she looked like.
Mhm.
Okay, very fast. They go over 25 knots. PC-552 could make at best 20. So they tried to chase her down. They did get a report on radar, and then they got a visual sighting, and they chased that S-112 all the way back to the Channel Islands. They did try to fire on it. They think they might have got a hit or two, but that's doubtful. But the ship escaped, but the Germans learned something from that. They learned they could draw that ship away. They learned that was the only guard ship in front of the harbor. So they learned something from us. So even though it was a failed mission, it was like we say, lessons learned in the U.S. military.
Yeah.
Okay, everybody ready? We're going to move forward. Okay, full speed ahead. This here is in let me see, was it in 27th of February? They decided they were going to relieve General von Schmettow and send him home on medical grounds. Now, there's the man who was going to take over, and I think he had a lot to do with getting him removed because he was kind of a diehard Nazi, this fellow. Um, and I think he probably reported back to his superiors, hey, this general, he's not doing things right. He's being too soft on these Channel Islanders. And he failed in his mission, and I can do better. So he managed to talk him into it. So he took over the Channel Islands.
I mean, this is the era of the hardliners coming in, isn't it?
Right.
Because you're going to have to be a very optimistic German leader to think there's any hope of coming out of this war with anything but a resounding kick up the arse, especially somewhere, as I say, to the Channel Islands. You've seen the American army and British and Canadian armies push their way through Normandy, press this, at this point, by early 45, this is the era of the hardcore guys coming in who don't really give a shit about whether or not they win or not. It's just about that whole prestige of kind of, in a sense, dying for the Fuhrer and doing your job. It's the ideological ones are the ones still there, aren't they?
Exactly. Very good point. And that's kind of what if you read this slide, which we're not gonna read all of it, but I would like to read a quote by a Major von Alves. He was a man of dangerous machinations, a dedicated Nazi, an ambitious man of unstable character, of great eloquence, and a master of rhetoric. He belongs to that category of Nazi who are so carried away and bemused by their own oratory that they can never be reckoned to be dealing honestly with themselves or others. So he did come from a Protestant family of pastors. So he kind of probably grew up knowing how to speak well and thought he was eloquent, but he was a bit kind of a blowhard. He was not well liked. As a matter of fact, he was a commander of the battle cruiser Scharnhorst early in his career, where his one great achievement was to run her aground at some point. Yeah. But anyway, he wanted to impress the Nazi high command, so he ordered a second attempt, and up in the upper right corner, just to Ultra, I got to mention Ultra. Maybe David Keefe will show up.
He might
But
be. He's on the channel himself in an hour's time. So yeah.
oh, can't wait. So that's the actual report they got of the relief of General von Schmettau at Ultra. So they knew that he was the new sheriff in town, and that's from after the battle, which I love. That I really encourage, if you want to learn about this raid, you got to read that article. Okay, this here is showing the breakdown of the assault groups in their various. I'm not going to read through the whole thing. You can read it for yourselves, but just mainly each group was tasked with different things. Group 1A, they were the ones that were going to be responsible for delivering the assault force to the port and destroy the port facilities. And they wanted to try to destroy the lighthouse and the signal station there as well. Okay, they were also given a tug to tow a captured coal or collier. Group 1B, they were a couple of minesweepers that were going to be kind of as fire support while they went in off the coast, the outer harbor. Group 2, that was the group that tangled with my grandfather in his ship. They was going to be the ones to engage and draw off the guard ship. And then their secondary mission was to destroy the Grand Chaussee lighthouse and keep reinforcements from getting to the port. Group 3, and here I don't mean any disrespect to my French brethren, but they were to meet with French collaborators and then raid the hotels where it was expected they would have officers there. They would use a small rubber landing craft. And I say collaborators, and I want to mention this. Granville, before the Third Army came through, was one of the main supply points for the Channel Islands. Not only did the Germans receive supplies from Granville, they called it a commandantur, which means command post there. And it was also the divisional supply point for the 315th Infantry Division, which occupied the islands. They had a lot of business going on with the French people there. You know, and even though they were occupied, they still have to make a living. They still have families to feed. They had to deal with the devil they knew. So they did business. Now, there was a couple of Channel Islanders that set up kind of a black market business going on there too. So I think there was a little resentment after the Germans were run out because a lot of these people lost some of their livelihoods. And let's be honest, the American force that went in there, they didn't treat the civilians as very well. They kind of looked down their nose on them, and it just wasn't the typical friendly American experience everyone thinks. I went to Europe in the 70s, and I sometimes noticed that some of my fellow soldiers, young men, far away from home, never been anywhere in their lives, they kind of sometimes I think they think they own the world, and that's called the ugly American syndrome. So I try not to be that way. And then there's in the bottom showing the assault detachments and the number of men. And they even had a Luftwaffe flat crew. Imagine offloading a 20 millimeter gun and pushing it around the port. But they actually did that. All right. So everybody ready to move?
Yep.
All right. This is a great map from the Jersey Bunkers tour showing the relative positions of all those assault groups. Now, the ones in yellow called AF 65, 68, 71, that is not where they actually were. You have to move those in your imagination. off a few miles off the coast, south of the Ile de Chaussee. That's where they were. So they never did come up there, but that's the approximate positions. Now this picture is taken after the raid. You can see that vessel under M412. That's actually a German minesweeper that went aground because of the shallow tide. All right, and they had to abandon her. These are examples of the types of ship. All right, and going to read something a little bit here real quick. Let me see where it is. Okay, the upper right, those are called Artillerieträger or Fahrplans. And that's two or actually three. That's the three vessels that my PC-564 tangled with. Now, they don't look like much, and they're not fast. They only go about 8 nautical miles an hour. They're armed, though, very heavily and heavily armored. All right. They were 300 tons, about 154 feet in length. They had a shallow draft of about 6 foot. They had a short range, only about 474 nautical miles, but plenty of range to go to the Channel Islands and back. They only had 48 men, but they had two 88 millimeter guns in turrets, 8 20 millimeter AA guns. They were, they call them the 4-barreled version, Flakvelings. And they had 137 millimeter AA guns. So that's a lot of firepower. And they had 20 millimeters of armor and 100 millimeters of concrete to reinforce that. Now, bear in mind, PC-564 had no armor. Her hull thickness was 5/16 of an inch. I think half tracks might have had better armor.
Yep.
Below on the right, you see that's three of the 4 minesweepers, because we know one was lost, but they were pretty heavily armored. They were big ships, all right. Let me see. They were about 200 feet long. They had a draft of 9.2. They're 27 feet wide. They had one 105 millimeter gun plus a 37 millimeter and up to 6 to 8 20 millimeter anti-aircraft guns. Of course, they also carried. They were provisioned to drop depth charges, but they didn't do that on this night. So those were the primary vessels that were transporting most of the assault group. And then on the upper left, you have those Havenschutzboote. They were the fast-moving ships that delivered part of the raiding force to the other side of Granville. And then those rubber dinghies there, they put that landing force on the island. All right, so just to give you some idea of the raiding force that PC-564 and Granville was encountering. This is a breakdown, blow-by-blow description. I won't bore you by reading everything. We're going to highlight some things, but these are directly from the Jersey website, and I also was able to find these in the various war diaries that I've read. So you can see on the late on the 8th of March, okay, that was the situation. You had the SS Kyle Castle, the SS Parkwood, SS Esquid, SS Nephrite, and SS Hayden. And that's in the port. That's the inner port. Outside the port in the anchor area was SS Gem, her accompanying escort HMT, Her Majesty's Tug Pearl, and USS PC-564 on patrol outside that. Okay, HECP means Harbor Entry Control Point. They were the main people who was coming in and out of the port. They were notified from Carteret. There was a radar station there. That there was contacts moving in, so they immediately notified the S2 of the 3rd Battalion 156th Infantry Regiment at Coutainville. Now, let me tell you, the 156th Infantry Regiment was a National Guard unit from Louisiana. All right, they never did any frontline duties throughout the whole war. They were only basically occupation troops, or they were POW guards. In this case, they were doing both. They had a detachment, a company in Granville that stayed in the billets on the high point, the rock they call it, and next to them in another billets was a unit of French infantry. I don't know how many, maybe a battalion at most. So they got further reports as time went on. Okay, they realized they weren't false targets, they were actual ships. So they sent a message to PC 564 saying, hey, warn HMS Pearl and go investigate these contacts. All right. A couple of PT boats were sent from Cap de l'Aigle to reinforce. They ended up turning around and going back to Cherbourg. PC 564 was requested to stand by for appropriate action and to tell HMT Pearl of the radar contacts and stand by to protect the collier. Remember, that's important.
Mm.
Okay. And so she set a course for the Grand Isle. That's also a name for Chaussee, Grand Ile. So the lighthouse there, so which is directly west. All right. They notified the unit, the Army unit there to stand to. That means, hey, get out of bed, guys. Get your gear on. They're coming. Now this one here, Major Brown, the commanding officer of Subport T401, the Granville port commander. He received information from the 156th Infantry that there were targets moving south at 10 knots. The port was blacked out, and the working POWs, the German POWs, were ordered from the collier ships back to the stockade. Now, here's interesting. 5 minutes later, the stockade called and said, hey, tell those prisoners to hold up. But they'd already started to head for the port. The officer in charge was informed to have them ready to move out if the alert was given. Okay. And then finally at 2400, Major Brown asked if it was an alert. He was told it probably is. They're coming in fast. So he tells, at this point, the 79 POW Germans arrived at the harbor for work duty. So there's a misnomer there. There's a mistake. Somebody was playing around with where these POWs were supposed to be. If there's an incoming raid, the last thing you want is a bunch of POWs in the mix. But I think this might have been some collaboration. I don't know. I can't prove it, but it seemed funny to me. Okay, so this here is the actual after action report that Lieutenant Percy Sandell typed up days after the battle. Now this is after he's had time to think about things. Okay, it's got some of the it's more like official language. It doesn't have the immediacy that you would have if you were actually describing this exactly while it was happening. So we're going to do something here. I'm not going to read from that. I'm going to start with this. There's the second page of the report to the left, and to the right, that's a chart made by one of the officers on PC 564 showing the battle area. And I'm going to, if you'll allow me, I'm going to read an excerpt from this book, and I want to do that to honor William Viegel. I was going to read some other accounts, but I want to read his because I think I just want to show some honor to this almost 100-year-old man who wrote a book about PCs. So let me see. We'll start here. At 23:15 hours, the radio man on PC 564 picked up an alert for his ship. They blurted out the positions of the 3 radar contacts, which you can see starting up there in the upper left of that diagram, heading south. All right. Between the islands of Chaussee and Jersey, and they tracked and identified them as German. They sent orders to the PC to intercept them. Lieutenant Percy Sandell, U.S. Navy Reserve, the skipper of PC 564, rang general quarters. The PC charged toward the contacts at flank speed. After a series of radar and navigational plots to intercept the targets, the captain commanded all ahead 2/3, so he slowed down a bit. So you can see that line coming from the anchor area, moving to the left toward the west, almost exactly due west. That's the progress of the ship. And you can see the anchor area is where HMT Pearl was guarding the collier, SS Gem, which was due to go in port the next day. And then she was going to escort the outgoing ships back to England. All right. At a range of 4,500 yards Sandell ordered the crew of the 3-inch gun to illuminate the targets. The night sky flashed to brilliance as PC-564 fired star shells over the enemy ships. Fear raced through the men on the bridge as they stared at the sight of 3 German gunboats, knowing that even one gunboat had them outgunned. Seconds later, a star shell from the German ships helped burst over the PC. Now I'm going to move forward here. This is going to be kind of dramatic. This is their pictures taken after the battle by Stanley Cusick of the damage done to the ship. And it'll make sense when you look at these as I read. The PC opened fire, and after one round from the main gun, it jammed. The German ships opened up with their larger guns, and the shells pounded the PC. A few minutes later, an 8.8 centimeter shell bored through the bridge of the PC and exploded. That's the first hit in the upper left. You can see the hole made by that shell. The blast, heat, and flying metal struck down all hands, says on the bridge, but it's in the wheelhouse, killing all but one person. One of those that was killed was the executive officer. As sailors raced to fight the fire, another shell tore through the chart hose. Now that is below it. It's actually the 4th hit. That's based on Lieutenant Sandell's report, but that shell that is right after the bridge and above there is the chart hose where it actually exploded in the wardroom below, but the concussion and fire and everything spread into the chart house. Okay, it's a very confined space. All right. Then German shells riddled the 40mm gun tub and crew. And if you look at the upper center, you can see that one of those rounds struck I guess it's a Weary, and blew it in half. And then shrapnel killed or wounded many of the members of that gun position. All right. As sailors raced, the German shells riddled the 40mm gun tub and crew. Motor machinist mate Scrappy Hoover, second class, tumbled from his post as the pointer. Shrapnel had riddled his body and splintered many of his bones. His buddies lashed him to a bomb rack as the ship rolled in the heavy sea. Bodies sprawled about the deck and bridge. Because of the severe damage to the engine room, they had taken some damage below. The steady roar of the PC's diesel engines faded to silence. The skipper ordered the men to stand by to abandon ship. Some of the men heard that standby order. Some of the men aft, on the chaos of the fantail and around that gun position, all they heard was abandon ship. All right. Sailors scurried about the deck, twisting tourniquets, wrapping bandages, and shooting morphine into shivering men with legs and arms bloodied and dangling or blown away. Below decks, the engineers lit off the engines again, under the direction of Lieutenant Sandell and Lieutenant Russell Klinger, the gunnery officer. The ship plowed ahead for the shore. It ground onto the rocks at La Baie de Vergueil near Cancale. Larry Jordan, Seaman First Class, wrote, "I never knew that land could look so good in all my life, but boy, that was the most beautiful land I'd ever looked at." So I thank you for bearing with me. That doesn't exactly jive with the report I read, but you get the idea of what a terrible ordeal it was to be in a fight like this at sea. There is nowhere to run. Okay, they don't have any armor on those ships. A round that strikes there is going to do terrible damage. Even if it doesn't kill you outright, it's going to do terrible damage to the human body. You can see in these pictures that third hit on the mast and knocked out all those 20mm guns up there. So within about 10 minutes or less, this ship was reduced to defenselessness against it. Now notice all the ships are above the water. All the hits are above the waterline. And I think there's a reason for that. This is my theory. I think the Germans intentionally didn't want to shoot the hull because they were hoping that they would abandon ship and then they could capture the ship. And what a propaganda coup that would have been.
Yeah.
So now I want to take note of the on the left, the second from the left on the bottom, very close to the K gun depth charges. If that round had not exploded on that Weary boat and had struck those depth charges, the whole fantail would have probably blown off. Then to the right, I call it the Fallen. I kept seeing pictures like the one to the left of it, very close to the gun. You see like what looks like bags inside the Weary. those are human bodies in body bags. It took me a while to figure it out, but those were among the, I think, 14 killed aboard the ship. That was about a quarter of the crew. And then about another quarter were wounded. And then a quarter of them abandoned ship. So this ship was pretty much down to 1/4 of the crew still able to operate. And there's a lucky sailor showing his helmet. I doubt he was wearing that helmet when that happened, because they would have entered his brain. Anyway, I'm sorry for the gruesomeness of these shots, but I think it tells the human story very well. Okay, here is the actual missing in action report, but it's where they found my grandfather's body the next day, and I'm going to explain how that happened. When he went aboard, he was slightly wounded, according to his shipmates, during the initial exchange of gunfire. So, but he was one who was with them on the fantail when they heard abandoned ship. So they began throwing life rafts overboard and jumping in. Now, the life rafts landed in upside down. At least one of them did. So he and several other of his crewmates were holding on to the ropes around that. And one of his shipmates that was with him, and of course by now the ship's moved off. They're heading south. They're skedaddling. They're getting out of Dodge. One of his shipmates with him had a little flashlight, and he thought it would be a great idea to say SOS with his flashlight. Well, the Germans saw that, and they must have interpreted it as, man, that's gunfire. So they fired a burst of machine gun fire in their direction. Nobody was hit except my dear grandfather. So the next day, the Royal Navy was making a patrol after this raid, and those are the 3 ships on the right, or examples of them that were on that patrol. And the HMS Ilfracombe, all right, was able to find him, get his body up out of the water, and they examined it, and they realized by his ID tags and his description that it was him. So they buried him at sea, and then they sent this off to the U.S. Navy, and this is the actual report. And then you can see on the one in the middle, that shows the burial at sea, and it shows the degrees and minutes for latitude and longitude. So we know exactly where he was buried, probably within 100 meters or so. And I just always been grateful to the Royal Navy that they did that. You know, they showed some respect to my grandfather. But he was initially reported missing, and for a long time, that's what my grandmother knew. This is the beautiful hotels. I hope I can see them in person one day. But they were the 2 main hotels, the Hotel Bains and Hotel Normandy, where the part of the raiding force went aboard and went into these hotels and captured some Americans. And there were several killed there, okay? Thank you very much, Lorelei. And thank you for Papa Russ and for all the sailors and soldiers who died in this
I'm
war.
feeling guilty for having sat in front of those hotels and had a beer. I'm feeling bad now.
Oh,
David.
no, next time
Mac
you're
had a hot
there.
chocolate and I had a beer. I've had some wonderful weekends in Granville, and yeah, I feel bad now.
Oh, no, next time you do that, raise one up for Lucien Lacroix.
I will do. I will definitely do that.
He would love that because he liked beer too. All right, this is a picture of the damage after. I love this photo, and I'm not going to read and bore y'all with that. You can look at that later, but they did a heavy damage to a number of the large cranes and some moderate damage to some. Some were not damaged at all. And some of the crawlers, they had various kind of ways to offload these ships. And you can see it once again how low the tide gets. That's the inner port. So, but you can see the damage to the buildings around. It put Granville out of action for at least a few days, and maybe they never got up to speed except maybe after a month or so. But it didn't ever really knock them out. Okay, but it did significant damage, and it did cause casualties. All right. So, and that's from Lieutenant Sandel's report. Here we're going to spend just a brief amount of time because I want to do some honor to the casualties, and I listed all the casualties. Yes, there's PC 564's KIA, 14 KIA, 11 wounded, and 14 MIA. There's the names. In the middle, I put the British casualties, and it was significant. You can see there were 8 KIA and 17 wounded and 8 missing, including this gentleman on the center right, Mr. John Alexander, who was a United Nations official that just happened to be with the officers. U.S. Navy personnel, or I'm saying U.S. Army personnel, there was Major Ben Ritter was killed and 22 wounded, and 1 U.S. Navy that were in the port on land, and 5 MIAs. That's the officers and this gentleman Alexander. To the right, unfortunately, there were 6 French civilians killed during the crossfire in the streets. Some of them just looking out the window at the wrong time, and sad. And there were 8 wounded, including 2 children, which really pisses me off.
Yeah.
And I also wanted to mention the German personnel. I mean, they were our enemies then, but they were brave and they did their job. And they lost 3 killed. And I think they were initially buried. They were buried near there, and then their bodies were later sent to Germany. 15 wounded. So they didn't get away scot-free. And then 1 MIA. They did capture 1 POW. I'm going to read you one last poem. I think this is a poem by Robert Louis Stevenson, famous poet from 1850 to 1894. And this was the epitaph also on his grave. I'll try to get through this. Under the wide and starry sky, dig the grave and let me lie. Glad did I live and gladly die, and I laid me down with a will. This be the verse you grave for me. Here he lies where he longed to be. Home is the sailor, home from the sea, and the hunter, home from the hill. And that, if you ever seen the movie, They Were Expendable.
Oh yeah, yeah.
John Wayne uses this poem in one of the scenes.
He does, doesn't he? Yeah.
And it tears me up every time. So this is a little memoriam to my grandfather. He does have his name listed on the wall of the missing at that cemetery in the upper right at Montjoie Saint-Martin in Brittany. And below the picture in the center, that's my one of my cousins, Carrie Lacroix, but her married name is McDonald. So she visited, I don't know when, but my mother gave me these pictures. And there's the chapel, beautiful memorial chapel there, and beautiful grounds. And the French people do such a great job of keeping up the cemeteries, and I'm grateful. Now on the left, those 2 photos on the left, the one on top, that's the entrance to the American Veterans Memorial Cemetery in Agawam, Massachusetts, where my cousin is from. He made an arrangement. Thank you, Ian. So nice of you to say that. He had a headstone erected. I don't know how he pulled it off, but he had a headstone erected in his honor. And I'll always be grateful to my cousin Paul for what he did in helping us learn this story. So that's my presentation. I hope I didn't bore everyone completely.
No, absolutely fantastic stuff, David. And Ricky over in the Channel Islands and Jersey has been answering some of the questions in the sidebars as we go along. I've answered a few of them. I think we're done. But I mean, as we said at the beginning, David, the thing about the Granville raid is it was against the flow of how the war was going. By March 1945, despite the fact there are some tough battles ahead of the Allies still as they push into Germany, that the writing is on the wall. The Third Reich is crumbling, and yet this raid, on a human level, and that's why I'm glad you've given us this angle. On a human level, it was devastating for a few dozen families. And this is where, like I said yesterday with the show with Brian, is that you have to wear your analytical hat and your emotional hat, because of course, as historians, we can look at the folly of this German raid and say, what's it going to achieve? Improving their morale, trying to get some supplies. And they're just delaying the inevitable. There's nothing that they can, even if it meets all its success, it's just delaying the inevitable for days, weeks, maybe. They put the harbor out of action. So what? The Allies have got hundreds of other harbors. But on a human level, it does, that's what brings these things down. And I think it reminds us that just because an event doesn't have a huge impact on the course of the war, and there are many we've covered on this channel, doesn't mean it doesn't have a huge impact on the course of the lives of the families involved. And I think it definitely falls into that category of the Granville raid. It's almost regarded, I think, as sort of not a joke raid, but it's like, what? The Germans are doing what? Trying to do what? You kind of reaction is to not laugh at it, but just go, what the hell are they thinking?
Yes,
So
exactly.
so thank you for just reminding us that it's actually still about people in a terrible situation. Those shells hitting those boats and the fear. And I just say nearly everybody involved in this has come and it's blindsided them. It's been a surprise and been caught off guard somewhat.
Yes, exactly. Another thing you always mention is nothing happens in a vacuum. What
Yeah,
else is happening?
yeah,
Operation Varsity is happening around this time.
yeah, yeah,
They're
yeah,
and the Ninth Army is getting ready to cross at Remagen
yeah,
a few days later. So there's like major events happening in Europe and around the world. Thank you, Ricky Lacaine. I appreciate that.
yeah.
But how it affected my family. My grandmother never really recovered.
Mm,
She had to remarry to a man that turned out not to be a very good man. He was kind of a drunk and a little bit abusive,
mm,
especially to the male children of the family. He ended up divorcing her. So she really was left alone again. And my mother and her siblings, they had to grow up without their real father. So
mm.
that's how deaths affect families. And I say that to German families, French families,
Yeah,
British families, Australia, all the families who lost
yeah,
someone.
yeah. Well, you've made me reaffirm why I do what I do on World War II TV. Like talking to Brian yesterday about the 106th Division in the
Oh,
Ardennes. It's easy to
brilliant.
focus on the 101st. It's easy to focus on the notable actions that the outcome is as you plan it or as you hope for, and it's got the kind of the comic book happy ending that the kind of the 101st does in Bastogne, but the 106th, all those thousands of guys captured, is equally an important, harrowing personal story. As we've said today, the Granville raid on a personal level is incredibly important, harrowing. And it's, I'm glad I don't just keep doing, the greatest hits, so to speak, on the channel. We've got Operation Veritable coming up in half an hour. Sean is asking, did the raids cause the Allies to reinforce other channel ports? I mean, I don't think so. I think they realized this was a one-off. The
A
Germans have
one-off.
shown
Yeah.
this is their last gasp. They put every offensive effort into this, and it's, as far as I know, there was nothing else even propositioned by the Germans, was there?
No, they kind of, like you said, they kind of had one of those moments, but when they realized it was the chances of them pulling it off again, now that it had happened, was slim to
Yeah,
none.
everyone's
Now,
on
von
guard.
Hofmeyer wanted to do another raid at another port, but
Yeah.
Admiral Dönitz kind of shut that down. And they did try
Well,
to do some insertions with commandos that didn't work out very well.
Well, David, we'll look forward to inviting you back, and we can't wait to see the book when it comes out because, as you see, your personal attention to the story has been fantastic. But I'm going to go and give myself a break because we're back in 30 minutes with the Operation Veritable roundtable with David, Mike, and Arthur, which had to be postponed because David was a bit unwell. So I'm looking forward to that. So thanks everybody for your questions and comments, and as always, and I will see you all in half an hour's time. Thank you, everybody. Cheers. Bye.
Take care, y'all.